In recent lessons in Plugin 101, we've been discussing ways to get at text from a Sublime Text plugin, how Sublime references files and presents them to us inside of the API, how we use points and regions to represent single characters or spans of text, and even how we can extract text out of the buffer to do something with it in our plugin. The flip side of that operation is if you take text out of the buffer, you probably want to put text in too, or modify something that's there. Today's the day we're talking about that. Hey, hello, fellas of Sublime Text Fanatics. Odette Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video course teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. And the topic of today's lesson is using a plugin in Sublime Text to insert, erase, or replace text inside of a buffer. Now, we've covered in the last few lessons the idea of how Sublime presents the contents of the file to us as one long contiguous string, how we can use a point to find any character inside of the file, regardless of its line and column, or use a region to specify a span of text that we're interested in doing something with, and even how we can extract contents out of a file into our plugin in order to do something with it, analyze it. Today, we're going to learn how we can take that text or other text and put it back into the file, or replace text in a file with something else, or just overall erase some portion of the text, which builds on all of the stuff that we've been learning up till now. Before we get into that, though, another quick reminder that we are almost at the end of November, the month that we spend writing code and celebrating it and teaching other people how to do it. And that's why over on my other channel, which is linked down in the description below, and a card above my head and in an end card theater at the end of the video, that we are doing 2 live streams a week until the end of November on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Pacific, working on Sublime Text packages. And if you are interested in plugin development and you have questions to ask and the course isn't going fast enough for you, or you need some clarification, do not hesitate to drop into those live streams or any of the live streams that we do and get your questions asked, and we will answer them right there live with examples walking you through these very things. And with that out of the way, let's jump into the meaty goodness of the lesson by looking at the plugin that we're going to be using today. And that is this plugin right here, which has 5 sample commands in it that we could use to insert, replace, and erase text inside of a buffer. We're also covering here a couple of pitfalls that you might run into while you're working with something like this, and some ways to solve them so you can get yourself up and running and save yourself some of the growing pains that we, believe me, all go through when we first start doing stuff like this inside of a plugin. Now, in order to understand this, you need to know what a text command is, why a text command is absolutely essential to use the API functions we're using here today, and what points and regions are, where you get them, so that you know how to do the inserts, replaces, and erases that you're actually trying to do. And if any of that doesn't quite make a lot of sense to you, if you haven't done it enough to get it firmly under your belt, never fear. Down in the description of the video, there's a link to the Plugin 101 playlist where we have covered all of these topics previously, and you can get yourself up to speed. Similarly, down there in the description of the video, there's also a link to this plugin code, so you don't need to pause and transcribe this yourself if you would like to follow along and experiment with this, because playing with things and seeing what they do is a great way to cement in your head the things you should and should not be doing inside of a plugin. While you're down there getting at the link to this plugin to play with it, if you haven't already done so, maybe you want to use the buttons to thumb, subscribe, and share, and ring the bell notification icon. That'll let YouTube tell you whenever I publish a new video here on the channel, so that you can get access to it right away instead of having to wait for it to pop up in your feed. Now, going into the very first example here, and what we're going to see through all of these examples as we use them is that whether we're inserting, replacing, or erasing text, we need to provide an edit object as the first argument to all of these things. And remember, the only way to get an edit object is to define a text command, and Sublime will give you an edit object as a part of the run method when the command is actually executed, which is why it is absolutely vital that if you're going to use these APIs, as we're doing here, that you create yourself a text command. There's no other way to safely get yourself an edit object. And remember, you can't keep these edit objects around from a previous command. You have to use the one that Sublime gives you when the command is actually executed, because it's using these edit objects to gather changes that are made as a part of a user action to be able to undo them. So you have to give it one of these so it can track when changes are actually being made. The simplest of those, of course, is in this first example where we're using the insert method on the view class to insert some text. And of course, we provide the edit object so it can track changes. The next argument here is the point in the file at which the insertion should actually happen. And now that we're familiar with points, we know that the position 0 in the file is the very first character in the file. So whatever this does, it's going to do something at the first position of the file. And we know it's an insert, so it's going to insert some text there. And the text that's going to insert is, of course, the third argument to this command, the hello world. world. And if I was to use the key that I bound to this command, we can see the text hello world injecting into the file right up there in that exact position. Now, this view.insert method actually returns back to you the number of characters that it wrote into the file, which can potentially be important for you for reasons that we're going to cover down in example 4 and 5. But this can happen because if you have the translate tabs to spaces option turned on, for example, that's going to tell Sublime whenever it tries to insert a physical tab character, it should expand it out to some number of characters. So if you needed to know exactly how much text was actually inserted into the buffer, this is the way to do that. You call this and then capture the return value. But let's say we don't want to insert text, we want to replace some text. And for that, we use the replace method on the view class, which works very similar to insert, only as the second argument, instead of taking a point that specifies where the replace should happen, it specifies a region, because you don't replace one character generally, you replace a section of the file with something else. So you need a region to do something like this. And here I'm using the region constructor to create a region that starts at position 0, the start of the file, and runs all the way to the length of this view, which is the way to get the number of characters that are actually stored in this. Another way to do this is to use the view.size method on this class as well. Either of these things will work, but the idea here is if you get the number of characters that are currently stored in the file, then that's going to be the inherent point at the end of the file, and thus this region spans the entire contents of this whole file. So when I press the key, we're going to replace the whole content of the file with the string hello world, and sure enough, that is exactly what happens. If you'd like to clobber away a large section of text, you can do that very thing here very quickly and very easily. Now, moving on to the third example, we're actually going to be erasing some text, which is something that you can, in all honesty, do with the replace, because what is an erase really but a replacement that replaces something with nothing, right? But this is sort of a shorter way to do that, more logically consistent, I would say. And it starts to illustrate how we generally do something like this in a plugin, because up to now, we've been using hard-coded values like position 0 or the entire content of the file. But that's not generally what you want to do for something like this. You want to be more targeted, and you usually need to build up your points or your regions or both in order to figure out what it is that you want to do. So what we're doing here is, first we need to capture a point, and we're going to choose a point that represents the cursor on this line right here. Now, we learned in the previous lesson that view.cell returns us a list of all of the selections that appear inside of the file. And this is a list. There could be more than one, so we're using subscript 0 to get at the first selection, which, remember, is always the one closest to the top of the file. No matter what order you make selections in, the list of selections in this property is always ordered from the top of the file down. For sanity reasons, you can make a lot of algorithms a lot easier to use if you know the order that these things are coming out in. And we'll see again more examples of that, why that's important in the next couple of examples here. Now, the actual contents of the selection is a region, and we learned, of course, that regions have an A and a B, a start point and an end point. For the specific purposes of a region that represents a selection, the B point, the second one, is always the one where the cursor is currently sitting. So if your selection goes from left to right, the B point is on the right. If you were to grab the selection with your mouse and drag from the right to the left, the selection ends on the left. That's the B point, and you can see that visibly in the selection. So the ordering of these things can be important. You use the B to get that. That's going to give us the position in the file where the first cursor is physically located. And then we use this API method that we learned about in the previous lesson to ask Sublime, you know this point, give me a region that represents the whole of this line. So we can use this to get the whole line, and then we tell Sublime to erase that particular line. Now, what you might expect to happen when I push the key here is that for this whole line to go away and everything to move up to take its place. But we'll see when I hit it, that's not actually what happens. This line just goes away. And there's a very good reason for that. If you remember when we learned about the line method, what we learned is it gives you the whole region that spans this line, but it doesn't include the new line character on the end, if there is one. Because we didn't specify that we wanted to erase the new line character, the new line is still in there, so the line is still there. If you'd like to remove a whole line, well, we can easily do that, because full line does the thing that what line does, but it also includes the new line if there is one. So if we were to save that, now when I push the key, that line goes away entirely, which is more like you might want to do for something like this. Moving on to example number 4, this is where we're starting to run into potential issues that you might have if you're doing something with many regions. And for our example here, we're using find all, which is again something that we saw in the previous lesson, to find all of the instances of the word command in this buffer. And what we're going to try to do is, as we see here, replace them all with the text CMD instead. This is a simple example of how you might do some sort of find replace operation inside of a plugin, but this applies to any situation where there might be a large number of regions that you want to do something with. You want to insert some text, you want to erase some text, you want to, delete some text, any of that sort of stuff. I think I said delete twice, but you get the idea. You might want to iterate over them. Now, if we look at this, what do we think is going to happen here? Because I'm going to tell you, it's not going to be what you think it's going to be unless you've run into this problem before, and then you know why we're talking about this here right now. But this finds all of the regions that have the text command. There's a fair number of it. It appears twice for every command in this file, for example. And it also appears in some strings down below and in this line that I'm looking at right now. For every one of those regions, let's go ahead and replace that with command. So you might very well expect all of the text command to be replaced to be CMD instead. But when I push the key, we can see that is most definitely not what happened. This does not look like the text command was replaced. There's lots of places in here where command still exists. The cursor is currently sitting in the middle of a line and has command in it. But you can start to see exactly what happened here if you look on line 5 of the file, because we can see first example command, that command replaced perfectly fine. But then the next one was in text command. And in text command, we expect it to say text CMD, but it doesn't. It says text com CMD. It's 4 characters off. There's 4 more characters there than we expect there to be. And as we continue forward, some of them don't seem like they were really modified at all. So the Sublime part of Sublime plugin on line 9 was modified. Now, of course, we need to think about this logically. The content of the buffer is a long string of text. We've asked Sublime, tell me the locations of all of the words, the occurrences of the text command. So it very dutifully says there's one starting at this position and it goes for 7 characters. And there's another one that starts here and it goes for 7 characters. And there's another one that's here and it goes for 7 characters. You have all of those locations pre-captured in your list ready to go. And the first thing we do is replace the one on line 5, taking something that used to be 7 characters long and replacing it with something that's 4 characters long instead, or sorry, 3 characters long. So 4 characters are missing there. That means the next region in the file and every region that follows it is now wrong by 4 characters, because that position was assuming that this thing that we just replaced was 7 characters when it was actually 4. And that's why the very next one that happens after this happens not where you might expect it to be, because the position in the file actually changed when all of the text moved up, if you will, into the place that it was deleted. And it just keeps getting more and more wrong all the way down the file that it goes. So that's why you want to be careful about doing something like this. Now, the expedient way to do something like this, and one that I would probably recommend if you definitely know you're doing the exact same thing to all of them and you don't want to worry about it, is to just make a slight modification to this thing. We can just go ahead and do this. Take the list that we were given and iterate over it from the bottom up instead of from the top down. This is why I said previously that the order of things in the file is actually very important to you, and why it's important that they always come from the top down, because you could run into issues if selections, if you were doing this on selections, went in the order that you actually made them. This would be a lot trickier to do. But by saying that we want to start at the bottom region and replace it going up, then we're totally fine with this operation, because when we replace the last one, remember, when you replace the contents of a region with text that's shorter or longer and not text that's exactly the same length, all the text that follows it, if you have any regions in there, they're wrong. but all the regions that are before it in the file are perfectly fine. Nothing has actually changed there. So by changing it from the bottom and rippling slowly up the file, you're, if you will, invalidating pre-calculated regions after you've already used them and no longer care about them. And that's why when I hit this key, now we can see it actually doing the thing that we expect it to do when we take this particular action. Now, the last command here is doing the exact same thing as the other one, but I've shown this in a slightly different way because logically speaking, one way we could solve the problem that we just talked about in the previous command is if we have a list of regions, start at the bottom and move our way up as we go, and that way we're invalidating regions as we move up. The ones that follow are wrong, but we don't care that they're wrong because we're done using them now. But that doesn't necessarily work if there's some things you want to do in some places in the file, and you might want to do these sorts of things piecemeal. And there's a variety of reasons why you might want to do something like that. So it's good to have something like this under your belt. Now, this is also why I mentioned that the view.insert returning the number of characters that were actually inserted is something that might be useful. It could be useful in a situation like this. We're not showing it as an example here because I wanted this to be the smallest, most succinct possible version of this that I could come up with. But the idea is this. Here we do the same thing that we did above, find all of the instances of the text command. But notice we have this value named adjust that starts at 0 because initially we have no adjustment we need to make. And we know that if the text we are finding is this text and we're replacing it with this text, command becomes CMD, then the difference of that in characters is how much wrong every region we have is going to be as it goes forward, and that accumulates as we go forward. So now we can iterate over all of these instead of reversing them like we just did in the previous one. We can take these in the first item to last item order, and what we have to do is create ourselves a brand new region that takes the adjustment into account. So in this particular case, we're saying that wherever the first position is in this region, subtract from it our rolling adjust value. And similarly for the B position. Now for the first one, the value for this is 0, so this does absolutely nothing. And then it performs the replace. Then we bump the adjustment by the number of things that we know are different because we know that it's 4 characters here. And cycle back up to the next one. Now when this one creates the next region, the region that it's getting out of the view.findAll, that particular region is wrong now because it doesn't take that adjustment into account, but we're creating a new one to adjust it, and we just keep going through and through just like that. So now when I hit 5, we see that one works even though we're going forward. So this can be an invaluable technique if you have a list of regions, you want to modify some but not others. The general idea, the general takeaway from this is you can modify regions that you already have to take into account changes you're making in the file, which can be an invaluable thing to do something like this fast and easy. Now, there are actually other ways that we could use to insert text into the buffer or replace it, but we're not covering that today. That's going to be the topic of a future lesson. If you'd like to know when that lesson becomes available, if you haven't already done so, you might want to use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share, and ring the bell notification icon so that you'll know, and show your support for the channel because your support is very much what makes these videos possible. And that is all I have for today. Remember, here in November, we're doing 2 live streams on my alternate channel, linked right over there on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Pacific. If you'd like to ask more questions about this or see some examples or just hang out and say hi, I'd like to see you there. And whether I see you there or in the next Sublime Text video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.